Darryl is currently one of the worst brawlers in the game, and is rarely picked over other tanks. The release of hypercharges and the increased power creep has brought Darryl from one of the best tanks to one of the worst. Let's take a look at how he fell so far, and what power creep is. To preface the video, I wanted to remind you guys to like, subscribe, and comment. I know it's cheesy and overdone, but it really is a great help to me and would be highly appreciated. Besides, look at this. Only 15% of you are subscribed. This is almost as saddening to me as Darryl not receiving any attention from Supercell. Almost. Also, make sure to comment down what your answer to the question on the first slide is. I'm interested in your guys' thoughts, so make sure to comment. With that out of the way, let's begin the Darryl discussion. Darryl is a tank, but so is every other tank. He isn't the most creative tank, and has abilities similar to other tanks. For example, his super is a straight line similar to Bull's, and his attack is in a similar pattern to that of Bull, and to a lesser extent, Rosa. This similarity to other tanks' abilities means that to be chosen above other tanks, Darryl will have to stand out. This will be important later in the video. For now, let's talk about the aforementioned attack. Darryl's main attack fires 2 waves of 5 shells, totaling 10 shells, with each shell dealing 480 damage. However, the attack deals less damage the farther Darryl is away from the enemy. Despite this, it becomes clear that Darryl has a capacity to deal large amounts of damage. If he's at the closest range to an enemy, he can deal 4,800 damage, which can turn into 14,400 damage with 3 shots. This can eliminate any brawler in the game, including Frank. Despite the great stats on paper, Darryl's main attack isn't perfect at all. His range is only 6 tiles, which is higher than other tanks, leading to him matching well against other tanks in Tank 1v1s, as he is able to deal large amounts of damage, but also keep his distance. However, he is often unable to deal as much damage against brawlers from other classes due to his short range. His reload speed is also 1.8 seconds and classified as normal, meaning that if he wastes even one of his shots, he will be at a disadvantage. Now, let's talk about arguably the most important part of Darryl's kit, his super. Darryl's super allows him to roll a distance of 7 tiles, and gains a 50% damage reduction to all damage during his super. His super also pierces through enemies, so if they are in his way, he'll deal 800 damage to them and go through them. Darryl's super is actually one of the most interesting supers in the game. At first glance, it looks like a remake of Bull's super, but in reality it is much more interesting. First of all, Darryl can use his super over water, which can increase his range. He can also hit an enemy twice if he aims his super correctly at a wall. You can't mention Darryl's super without mentioning a little piece of unknown knowledge that literally everybody knows. Darryl's super range used to span the entire map. Specifically, for around a year after Darryl's release, his super range was at astonishing 23.3 tiles. His current super range is at a measly 7 tiles in comparison, meaning that his super range was divided by 3. Insane. In that same balance change where his super tile range was divided by 3, he got a full rework. His super was made easier to charge, and he got an early version of the super charge trait, allowing him to automatically charge his super over 20 seconds. This made it so that he no longer had to play as risky and aggressive in order to charge his super, and for the first part of the game, he could play more passively in order to charge his super. As for his nerfs, his main health was decreased, his main attack damage was decreased, his super attack damage decreased, and his super range decreased. Before this rework, Darryl was a tanky brawler who had a powerful but difficult to charge super, as well as a powerful main attack. In other words, he was similar to other tanks like Bull, with a very powerful main attack and slow charging but powerful super. After the rework, his lower health meant that he could no longer tank shots like he used to, but his increased ability to get his super meant that his mobility was increased heavily, and he was able to approach brawlers much more effectively and move up the map as a tank. And for a while, this niche suited him. There was a definite reason to choose him over other tanks like Bull or Primo because he was able to be more mobile than the others, with his automatically charged super and faster charging rate. He had his specific niches in game modes as well. In Heist, his ability to roll over water and deal absolutely ridiculous amounts of damage. Like most other tanks, he was good in Brawl Ball, with his large health and his ability to knock back. He could also shoot the ball up and use his super to roll into it and score quickly, making him a very dangerous pick in Brawl Ball in the hands of a skilled player. He was also a solid pick in other game modes like Gem Grab and closed hot zone maps. But you get the idea, Darryl was a solid brawler and had a good niche in the meta. But as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end. As we know now, Darryl is a very solid F-tier brawler. But as I just mentioned in the slide before, he was a very solid tank pick and was a consistent B or even a tier. So what caused this fall? The first thing that caused it was something called power creep. What is power creep? Well, power creep is defined as when new updates constantly bring more and more powerful characters or abilities to the game, making the old ones useless and underpowered in comparison. For understanding, let me give an example from another game that is even more popular, FIFA, also known as EFC. Let's say you got a 90 rated card right when the new game released. For a while, it will be one of the best cards in the game, and will be very useful to you. However, as time goes on, more and more powerful cards will be released. Someone else may have someone at 91, 92, or 93 rated. Even though your card hasn't been decreased in any stat, it has decreased in value because the cards around it have gotten better. This is power creep. So how does this apply to Darryl? For the past few years, Darryl hasn't gotten any significant buffs or nerfs, which means his place in the meta would be based on the strength of tanks in general and of other brawlers. For the strength of tanks, the power of tanks had been decreasing over the past few years before the release of hypercharges. The release of brawlers who had tools to effectively deal with tanks, and the lack of range and ability that tanks had to deal with new and powerful threats, meant that their place in the meta was slowly slipping. Rarely in a tier list video did you see a tank breaching the A tier, let alone the S tier. Due to this dip in tank power, there was an obvious impact on Darryl as well, who struggled to combat against powerful tank counters like Otis, Maisie, Chester, and Cordelius. This leads me to my next point, which is the power of brawlers around Darryl have been steadily increasing. Many of the new brawlers that have been released in the past year or two have been very powerful. I've already named a few examples in the last slide, and there were even more examples like Buster, RT, and even Janet for a while. With other brawlers getting balance changes that made them powerful, like Meg and Shelly for example, Darryl was slipping in the meta. Other brawlers were getting more powerful, and Darryl was just relying on basically the same stats that he had been for years after his rework. And then hypercharges dropped. Hypercharges were a death sentence to Darryl. Imagine seeing everyone around you get stronger and stronger while you are still the same. Just when you think it can't get worse, everyone around you gets an absolutely broken ability while you don't. This is basically what happened to Darryl. With each new hypercharge batch, more and more brawlers got hypercharges, while Darryl was forsaken time and time again, leading him to falling down in the meta, as he simply couldn't compete with the hypercharged brawlers with his lack of balance changes over the past few years and his lack of a hypercharge. The release of hypercharges brings me to my next point of why Darryl fell so far. Other tanks. As I've mentioned before, tanks had a delicate balance with each other. Many of them had their own niches, and they were all useful in their own ways. In closed maps with a lot of walls, Jackie was very useful. In a game where you needed wall break, El Primo was useful. Does the map have an abundance of bushes? Rosa or Bull was useful. Did the map have water, or was the game mode heist? Then Darryl was useful. You get the point. Each tank had their own niche, and you could make a good argument for using any of them. And then hypercharges dropped. I've said that before? Oh, ahem. Anyways, let's talk about hypercharges and tanks. When hypercharges first dropped, two tanks got their hypercharges, Bull and Jackie. The mere release of their hypercharge completely disrupted the tank balance immediately. Suddenly, there wasn't really a great reason to use Darryl anymore. Bull and his hypercharge had taken over Darryl's niche in heist, and Jackie and her hypercharge took over any other miscellaneous uses Darryl may have had. I mean, why would you pick a brawler without a hypercharge when you can pick another brawler that may not have completely filled up Darryl's niche, but made up for it with the most broken ability in the game? If things weren't already bad enough, Darryl's other tank counterparts in Frank, El Primo, Rosa, and BB have all gotten their hypercharges and have a solid place in the meta. Even if some of them aren't great in this meta, there is more of a reason to use them than Darryl has. And unlike Draco and Meg, Darryl's stats and kit just aren't good enough to compete with hypercharged brawlers. Speaking of Darryl's kit, let's take a look at it. First, let's take a look at his gadgets. His first gadget is Recoiling Rotator, which shoots 15 shells around Darryl, with each shell dealing 600 damage and charging 25% of Darryl's super. This isn't a great gadget and rarely hits opponents. His other gadget is Tar Barrel, which creates a 2.33 tile radius of slowing tar around Darryl for 5 seconds. This is also not a great gadget. The 2.33 tile radius means that the only time this would actually be useful is when Darryl is right next to an opponent. Tar Barrel is able to be used in tandem with Darryl's super, so if he aims his super well, he can slow an enemy as well as knocking them back, which could be useful. However, the range of the Tar Barrel is so small that it's rarely useful. Let's now take a look at Darryl's star powers. His first star power is Steel Hoops, which gives Darryl a 25% damage reduction for 2 seconds. It's okay, but isn't really that useful, and doesn't even last long enough, or have enough of a reduction to make a real difference. His second star power is Rolling Reload, which doubles his reload speed for 5 seconds. It sounds good, but in reality, it doesn't have many uses other than sometimes in Heist. Why did I spend 2 slides talking about the most boring kid in the game? To show how bad it is. Let's say Darryl with a gadget and a star power is 100% of his power. If you had 0 gadgets or star powers for Darryl, he would probably be at around 95% of his power. His gadgets and star powers are basically useless. Let's compare this to probably his most similar tank in Bull. Bull's gadget is an absolutely essential part of his kit, and his shield star power is a very good addition to Bull. Overall, and keep in mind this is a rough estimation, I would say Bull without his kit is at around 50% of his full power. Of course, Darryl shouldn't be overly reliant on his kit like Bull is, but Darryl should at least have some element of power inside of his gadget/star power. Not only do other tanks have hypercharges while Darryl doesn't, but they have actually useful star powers and gadgets that help boost their power. At this point, Darryl has to match up against other tanks with only his base stats, while other tanks have good hypercharges, star powers, and gadgets to add on to their base stats. And this makes it so that there is no point in upgrading him, because he has no good gadgets, no good star powers, and no hypercharge. He is genuinely useless and has been completely abandoned by Supercell. As a Darryl main, this change is sad to see. I used to be able to fight evenly against others with Darryl and be able to justify picking Darryl over other tanks. Now, unless my enemies are noobs or it's Heist Quickfire, Darryl won't be able to do anything. Furthermore, my teammates are going to give me thumbs downs and spin on me once they see I pick Darryl. A terrible fate I wish on no other person's main. So how can we fix Darryl? The first and most obvious fix would be to give him a hypercharge. This would put him on an even playing field with the other hypercharged tanks, and would be one step closer to repairing the balance between tanks. However, this isn't enough for Darryl. Basically, every other tank has a viable gadget and star power, so Darryl either needs a rework to his current gadgets and star powers, or completely new ones. I believe this would be enough for Darryl to finally be able to compete with other tanks and the rest of the meta. Personally, I believe Darryl's stats are quite balanced even with the power creep, and that he can be meta with just a hypercharge and reworked gadgets and star powers. I know this wasn't the most traditional PowerPoint, so I hope you did enjoy this. And fellow Darryl mains, don't give up hope. There's no way Darryl doesn't get a hypercharge next update. No way. Thanks for watching. Watch this video, or this playlist, or join the Discord server.